Deputy Thomas Pringle.
Thanks, Cathaoirleach. Minister, this revised estimate is for a very wide-ranging brief, and you could really spend an awful lot of time discussing all the ins and outs of it. But I want to particularly focus tonight on the programme expenditure titled An Efficient, Responsive and Fair Immigration, Asylum and Citizenship System, which, according to the estimates presented to us in this programme, has an increased projected budget of 25%, from 116 million to approximately 145 million. Of the 145 million allocated, there is an increased expenditure for asylum accommodation of 17.2 million euros. Yet there is no breakdown of where and how this money is going to be spent. And I hope, Minister, you will provide a breakdown to the House to show exactly where this money is going. And despite the increase, there is no indication that additional staff numbers will be provided to process asylum seekers, which leads me to question your claim that the reform of the asylum system is underway. Last week, you confirmed that the Department of Justice has implemented 91 of the 173 recommendations from the Working Group report. But again, you have provided very little detail in your reply on the recommendation, and we're still no better at understanding how, in fact, you've actually implemented these recommendations. All you've provided in your PQ reply were ticks and boxes marked implemented. Put simply, Minister, the budget does not match the level of reform that you say has been carried out. Sufficient funding is central to any reform programme. The McMahon report stated that a failure to invest in decision-making staff will inevitably lead to significant backlogs in case processing and a consequent need to accommodate ever greater numbers in direct provision. With all the attendant concerns the report quotes, I don't need to go into what is meant by attendant concerns, because it is well documented how degrading it is for people in long-stay direct provision. While I acknowledge that certain changes were made in terms of the provision of staff resources, for example, the extensive changes to the Refugee Appeals Tribunal membership with a new panel of members appointed during late 2013 and 14, it did take time to appoint and train new members, which inevitably has affected the Tribunal's case processing capacity. Additional resources were also provided for the establishment of ORAC, including an appointed legal panel of 20 people to deal with a backlog of cases, 4.8 internal staff and additional 16 support staff. There has been an increase in the direct provision weekly payment, the first since 2000, which has raised child benefit by €6 per week to the rate of $15.60 per week, but it fell far short of the rate of $29.80 recommended by the Working Group. These attempts are far from the recommended allocation of resources as set out in the Working Group's McMahon report. The Working Group undertook and costed a financial modelling exercise which included the long-stayer solution, effectively granting over 4,200 people 5 years or more in the system leave to remain in a speedy, effective manner on a legally sound basis. It also costed the introduction of a single procedure which is underway with the passing of the International Protection Act 2016. Despite a commitment from the Government for an additional budget allocation to deal with the demands on the asylum and immigration systems, including backlog cases identified in the report, there are huge concerns regarding the capacity of the various authorities charged with making decisions on protection applications. Without the extra resources, the benefits of the single procedure and speeding up the processing of applications will not be achieved, especially as the number of applications may increase over time. Reducing time spent in the system would see a reduction in the numbers in direct provision, a reduction in the pressure put on its accommodation needs, and would bring large savings to the state, which then can be reinvested in integration and child benefit for asylum families. Put simply, each year a person remains in the system, it costs the state an average of almost €11,000 for the provision of accommodation. Today, in the estimates, the provision of an additional €17 million for asylum accommodation is an indication of the increased pressure on the existing protection system. While addressing the accommodation needs is absolutely necessary, it is a reflection of the fact that little reform has been carried out on the asylum process as a whole. Huge savings could be made, Minister, if the recommendations were properly implemented. Again, the Working Group calculated potential savings in the amount of €194 million over 5 years. That number justifies the expenditure of €135.4 million over the same period, and which are required to fund the recommendations the Minister claims the Department are undertaking. The additional €135 million costs are broken down between improvements to the protection process, costing €14 million, improvements in living conditions and direct provision accommodation centres costing €69 million, and improvements in supports to applicants costing €52 million. A reformed system would see increased staffing to facilitate speedy processing of applications, meaning less reliance on direct provision, less pressure on the direct provision system, and more scope to increase social welfare allowances, etc. The financial modelling exercise demonstrates conclusively that investing in decision-making not only yields returns in reducing time spent in the system, but also makes financial sense. A lack of reform in the protection system might cost the state more money in the long run, but the human cost from the failure to act will be too high. It is the asylum applicants and their families who will pay the greatest price in this system. I would also like just briefly to mention, just in relation to the crime statistics and the resourcing of the Gardaí, which is vitally important to deal with the upsurge we have in gangland crime across the country. But I think we also need to focus, and you should talk to the Minister in Children, Youth Affairs and Education as well, and funding diversionary projects for young people in communities that are at risk of high levels of crime. These areas have suffered successive cuts over the years and are at a standstill now in the probation services, juvenile diversion programmes and community service orders. These type of creative programmes can deliver and divert young people, especially young men, away from crime, and that's vitally important for looking to the future and ensuring that we divert people away. While it won't deal with the crisis that we have at the moment, it means that we won't be looking at future crises further down the road as well in the future. Thanks.